Good evening and welcome to another edition of the Tired F1 pod. Today it's just me, Shez, um, talking to you after a weekend where I was at the Australian Grand Prix. It was huge fun. Um, and some of the things that we're talking about are a little bit out of sync. So as I'm recording this, the Grand Prix has actually already happened. Amar is safely tucked up in bed in Los Angeles. Um, but we are going to talk about some telemetry from qualifying because there were a few things that were a little bit interesting. And there were two sets of telemetry that I wanted to look at. The first was just having a little look at Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen in their Quali 3 efforts, and then having a little look at Lewis Hamilton and George Russell to see how Lewis managed to get himself knocked out in Quali 2. So let's start with Sainz and Verstappen. And the big question that I asked at the top of this video is, could Carlos have actually got pole? I think the short answer to that is probably not, but he was potentially in the running for it. The first thing I want to say is that Max Verstappen's lap was pretty out of this world. A 1:15.915 was by far the quickest lap that anybody did across the weekend, and the only driver that managed to drop below the 1 minute 16 threshold. I don't think anybody has seen anything as quick as that around Albert Park ever. So, I mean, Max was just driving incredibly this weekend. And it was a shame, spoiler, that we didn't get to see what he could do in the race. But let's have a little look at the qualifying runs. And the first thing I wanted to look at was actually Science's final Quali 2 run. And this is just the time. So you can see here that Science did a time of 1 minute 16.189 at the end of Quali 2, whereas his fastest lap at the end of Quali 3 was a 1:16.185. He only improved by half a tenth. And and actually his final lap, although quicker than his first lap in Quali 3, his first lap in Quali 3 was actually slower than his Quali 2 time. So there was probably a little bit of time left on the table. I think we'll see that as we look at the rest of the telemetry. So here I've got our usual telemetry slide. And what we're looking at here is just sector 3. So sector 3 takes us from just before the turn 9, turn 10 piff paff chicane, the really quick one in the middle of the lap. Um, and as usual, at the top, I have the speed trace. Underneath that, I have the delta, the throttle trace, and then the brake trace. And across the x-axis, the horizontal line, as usual, we have the distance across the track. So at the beginning, at the far left of the graph, we have the entry into turn 9. And then at the end of the graph, we have the start finish line and the end of the lap. On the second graph, we have the delta. That shows two lines. The first line, the blue line, is the reference line. That's the lap of the fastest of the two drivers that you're comparing. And in this scenario, that's Max. So Max is represented by the blue straight line. And the other line, the red line, is Carlos. And the delta just tells us what the difference is between the driver that we're comparing to the fastest driver and whether they were quicker or slower and by how much at a particular point in the track. And if a driver is above the reference line, so if the red line is above the blue line, that means that Carlos was slower in that segment. And if the red line is below the blue line, that means that Carlos was quicker. And then beneath that, again, we've got our throttle and brake traces. And our throttle trace just gives us the percentage of throttle. So at the top of the line is 100% throttle, and at the bottom is 0% throttle. And in the brake trace, the bottom is no brake, and at the top is full brake. So let's just have a little look at what the graph is showing us. So the first thing I want to look at is just what corners we're looking at. So I've circled here the different corners. So we're talking turn 9, which is the turn into that pith path. Turn 10, which is the exit of that corner, and then the acceleration onto the straight that follows it. Turn 11 is the big stop. There's a 90-degree right-hander. And that's followed by turn 12, which is essentially just an acceleration zone, and just a corner in which the drivers shouldn't really need to brake at all, just to scrub off a little bit of speed before they hit the big turn 13, which is a left-hander, before they come round again through turn 14, which they accelerate through as they head onto the back straight, onto the pit straight, sorry. And that's denoted by all of the lovely yellow circles that we have on this graph. Now this is what I really want to show you. So if we look at the delta, as Carlos and Max come into turn 9, they're both roughly neck and neck. But in the middle of turn 9 and turn 10, you can see that the delta suddenly splits quite far, and Carlos is a lot slower than Max. Their time difference becomes greater, and Carlos is the slower of the two. If we look at the throttle trace through that section, you can see that Carlos comes off the throttle on the exit of turn 9 and into turn 10, and has a big stab at the brakes as well. So I just want you to try and imagine that. So Max has come in, he's taken turn 9, he's taken turn 10 really smoothly. You can see on speed trace that he's smooth in, smooth out, and there's a nice constant curve to that blue line on the speed graph there. Whereas on Carlos's speed graph, he comes in, then there's a big drop off. So he drops off his speed quite a bit below what Max does. And that's the point at which he comes off the throttle and hits the brakes. And that, I think, is where he had a big mistake. So he lost the back end of the car a little bit and had to correct it. And he then lost a huge amount of speed on the following straight. And you can see on the speed graph that Max carries greater speed to the end of that straight and into the turn 11 right-hander. And Carlos is not able to catch up. And if you look at that delta across the rest of the lap, right the way to the end, Carlos never catches that up. So he makes a mistake in turn 9 and 10, and he never makes up the difference. And I think that was one of the main reasons why he wasn't able to match Max. But there are a couple of other little things to have a look at here as well. And the other interesting corner was turn 12, which we said was just an acceleration zone. So he shouldn't have to brake in there. But you can see on the second couple of yellow circles that although Max comes off the throttle more than Carlos does through turn 12, Carlos is hitting the brakes through there as well. And I just wonder if you put those two things together, Carlos having his mistakes through turn 9 and 10, and then needing to stabilize the car through turn 12, is the Ferrari just not quite as happy in the high and medium speed corners as the Red Bull? Perhaps because its strength seems to lie in the slow speed corners. So if we look at the minimum speed into turn 11, Carlos is actually faster. He has a slightly higher minimum speed and is able to carry that speed through to the end of the following straight. And also into turn 13 and 14, that big stop when they turn into the left before they then take a right onto the pit straight. Carlos has the higher minimum speed again and is still able to carry a bit more speed up the pit straight compared to Max. So in the low speed, the Ferrari seems to be doing all right. but in the high and medium speed corners, there seems to be a bit more trouble. And this is really accentuated by the fact that Carlos had a big made a big mistake into turn 9 and 10. So really in conclusion there, Carlos probably would have been closer without a massive moment into turn 9, or at least a moment into turn 9. And he either got his tyres dirty or the Ferrari still has a deficit through those high and medium speed corners. It makes up for those in the low speed corners, but in this situation, it wasn't enough for Carlos to make up that pace and vie for pole. But who knows? Without that mistake, he may have been there. This big surprise of qualifying was Lewis Hamilton getting knocked out in quali 2. And this was pretty interesting because he got knocked out at the end of quali 2 by only half a tenth. And the driver that he lost out to in 10th was his teammate, George Russell. So George was only half a tenth quicker than Lewis, but it was enough to drop Lewis out of qualifying, so he couldn't participate in quali 3 and had to start 11th. But it was interesting because I think we're going to have a few conversations about Lewis's qualifying record, especially this season, because he seems to have struggled a little bit. And this is probably going to be held up as an example. But there are a few things that I want to talk about which suggest that perhaps Lewis wasn't as off the pace as it might seem compared to his teammate, but that there's a much bigger, a much wider Mercedes problem here. So I just want to first of all look at some time. So this is Lewis's fastest FP3 time. Okay, so he did a 1:16.806 in FP3, and that gave him, I think, fourth in FP3. He was pretty quick in FP3. George coming in just behind him. But if we then have a look at his final quali 2 time, it was a 1:16.96. He was a tenth and a half slower in quali 2 than he was at the end of FP3. And that was enough to put him 11th. And that tells me that Mercedes didn't improve between FP3 and quali 3, or quali 2, sorry, versus everybody else. Because in FP3, Lewis was 4th, and in quali 2, he was 11th with a time that was only a tenth and a half slower. And his teammate, who was only half a tenth up the road, only managed to get 10th. So clearly, there's something about that car that either did go backwards a little bit between the cooler conditions in FP3 and hotter conditions in qualifying, or they just weren't able to make any developments between those two sessions. And both of those things are actually pretty worrying. But let's just have a little look at what happened at the end of quali 2. And the interesting thing here is, again, we've got our usual graph. So we've got our speed trace at the top, delta second, and then throttle and brake underneath. And the interesting thing here to look at is the delta. So the delta, this is us again looking at sector 3. In the first two sectors, George was the quicker driver. But by the time that we start sector 3, again, the reference line is George because he had the quicker lap. That's the straight turquoise line in this graph. And the line that we're comparing it to is Lewis, which is the white line here. And we can see here that for the first part of sector 3, actually they're about neck and neck. And actually Lewis is maybe a little bit faster. And then he really, really attacks turn 11, brakes quite a bit later, carries more speed at the apex, and actually his delta across turn 11 and up to turn 14, he's actually the quicker driver. So at that point, Lewis was on course to beat George's time, but something happened. And we saw this trackside. We could see on the big screens that Lewis had a, a correction between turn 13 and turn 14. You could see that his hands moved, and this is borne out here by the telemetry. And I've drawn some yellow circles just to highlight what that showed. So in the top graph, the yellow circle is around the speed graph. You can see that Lewis's speed drops off in the middle of turn 13, 14. And in the bottom graph, you can see that although Lewis keeps his foot in, the throttle's full, he takes a little stabilizing stab of the brakes. So there's a little stab of the brakes. If I had the steering trace, I think you'd see a little correction there as well. And you can see at that exact point, the delta switches over. So Lewis goes from being the faster driver to being the slower driver as the white line goes above the turquoise line. That, I think, is where Lewis lost his time. He made that mistake in turn 13, 14, where he had to stab the brakes, make a little correction, and he lost enough time, just half a tenth, but enough for George to be ahead of him and knock him out of quali two. And I guess the question that I have is, this little mistake is a sign of Lewis just making a little mistake, just a little error that can happen to anybody, and that's what cost him the time? Or is it him just not being comfortable with the car and making an uncharacteristic mistake, however tiny? Because remember that it's tiny margins that decide positions in this sport. Is it him just pushing a little bit too hard because he's not comfortable with the car? And that's what caused the mistake. That's what I don't know at the moment. And I think me and Amara will talk about that a little bit more in our race discussion later in the week. I hope you enjoyed that. See you next time in the next one. Please like and subscribe. Thanks, guys. See you later.